then you will tend to be more alert. And should it be deliberate or not? In other words, do we just default to however we happen to be breathing? Or should it be deliberate? That is, should we be controlling the depth and the cadence? And I do believe that based on what we know about the capacity for specific patterns of breathing to shift our brain state, that controlling one's pattern of breathing during meditation can be enormously useful. And that is true regardless of whether or not one is focusing on interoceptive perceptions within our body or exteroceptive perceptions. So that raises the question, how should we breathe during meditation? Well, there's, again, no simple one-size-fits-all rule there, but there are some general rules of respiration physiology that can help us access and develop a meditation practice that is going to best serve our goals. And since this is not an episode all about respiration, and we will do one, but I simply want to give you the basics of what respiration can do to shift your brain and body state. Before I do that, however, I want to give a very specific instruction, which is when you sit down to meditate, or if you're going to do your meditation walking, that's fine too. I should just say when you are about to begin your meditative practice, you need to ask yourself a question. Do you want to be more relaxed than you are at present? Or do you want to be more alert than you are at present when you exit the meditation practice? Do you want to calm down or do you want to become more alert? Simple question. You can decide from session to session. You could even switch within a session. But just as you need to assess whether or not you are leaning more interoceptively or exteroceptively, you also need to ask yourself, do you need to calm down or want to calm down, or do you want to be more alert at the end of your meditation session? Or maybe you want to go into a state of deep relaxation and then exit with more alertness. The way to do that is very simple, using breath work and specific patterns of breathing. And here is the general rule that is supported by all the respiration physiology that I'm aware of. I'm oversimplifying here, but I'm oversimplifying intentionally so you can simply apply the tool. And then, as I mentioned before, we will do an episode all about respiration physiology in the future. Essentially, if your inhales are longer and or more vigorous than your exhales, then you will tend to be more alert, or you'll shift your brain and body towards a state of more alertness. This is simply based on the way that the neural circuits, like the pre-Botzinger nucleus and the parafacial nucleus, that govern respiration physiology and alertness, simply the way they work. They communicate with brain areas that release noradrenaline, norepinephrine, etc. In contrast, if you emphasize longer duration and or more vigorous exhales relative to your inhales, you will tend to relax more. You will tend to calm your nervous system. Now you might be saying, okay, I understand what it is to make an inhale longer than my exhale, but how do I make it more vigorous? Well, it simply means drawing more air into your lungs more quickly than you allow yourself to exhale that air. So an example of inhale biased breath work would be, so there's an active emphasis on the inhale, and it's a little bit longer than the exhale, which is passive. Conversely, if you want to relax, then you want to extend your exhales relative to your inhales, and you can even make them active exhales. So it can be inhale, exhale. That's going to shift your nervous system in a direction of more calm. And of course, if you would like to stay at the level of alertness, aka calmness, because those are two sides of the same seesaw or the same continuum, if you'd like to be right where you're at the end of your meditation as where you started, at least in terms of levels of alertness and calmness, well, then you would just keep your inhales and your exhales relatively balanced in terms of duration. Now, the introduction of things like breath holds with box breathing or Wim Hof breathing, typically it's 25 or 30 deep inhale, exhales, deep inhale, exhales, and then exhale all your air, hold your breath for 15 to 60 seconds, and then repeat, and so on. Sometimes some inhales and holds. Well, that's a whole business into itself. But for sake of meditation, the key thing to understand is that if you are going to do a complicated breathing practice, it will by design, by necessity, shift much of your attention to the breathing practice, especially if it's not cyclic, if it's not inhales follow exhales. Cyclic breathing is where inhales always follow exhales, follow inhales, follow exhales. It actually relies on a specific brain center called the Prebot-Singer complex, discovered by Jack Feldman at UCLA. He was a guest on this podcast previously. However, if you are doubling up on your inhales, so 2 inhales and then an exhale, a pattern of breathing my laboratory has studied extensively, well, then that relies on a different brain center, the parafacial nucleus. The point is that if you are engaging in non-cyclic breathing, or you are deliberately emphasizing inhales or exhales, or the vigor of inhales and exhales, etc., well, then some portion of your attention will be devoted to making sure that you follow that breathing practice. We are very good at going into cyclic breathing practices by default, and our attention can drift to other things, interoceptive or exteroceptive. Doesn't matter. We can just drift into, how our body feels, or something we see or hear in the room, etc. When we are focused on our breathing and the breathing pattern is non-cyclic or complex in some way, in that it involves deliberate voluntary commands, again, from those so-called top-down mechanisms of the prefrontal cortex, well, that by design requires some portion, often a significant portion of our attention, to be devoted to the breathing practice itself. So what does this mean? This means that breath work itself can be a form of meditation, and meditation can involve breath work, but one should know that the more deliberate and unnatural that pattern of breathing is, the less you will be able to focus on other things. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can actually leverage this. So for instance, if you're somebody who's very much caught in your own head, right? We talked about this earlier. You happen to be, or you're in a moment where you're really stuck in your head and you want to get out of your head. Well, then that meditation practice that you do really should be focused on exteroceptive bias. You should really focus on something external to you. And I would encourage you to use a natural cyclic pattern of breathing, where inhales follow exhales, follow inhales, follow exhales. If, however, you are finding that you're sort of caught in the landscape of things happening around you and you want to ground yourself, as it's sometimes called, that's a loose language, not a scientific language. I know there's this practice of grounding, and that's a whole thing. People always writing to me, is grounding a real thing? Walking barefoot on the earth and magnetic fields and, and gravitational fields. Well, gravity is real, but, grounding, there isn't a lot of science for it, to be frank. Does feel nice to walk on the ground, however. But if you are somebody who's kind of feeling pulled out of yourself a lot or in a moment, and you want to bring your awareness into your body and sort of calm down, well, then I would encourage you to, yes, use a deliberate, somewhat unnatural or non-default pattern of breathing, which by definition will force you to attend to what's going on interoceptively. Again, I'm not aware of any place that this has been discussed in detail such as this before. If there is a research literature on this, please let me know. My laboratory has been working on this extensively. I'm always looking for new colleagues and collaborators. We meaning Dr. David Spiegel, who's an expert in hypnosis, again, who's been a guest on the Huberman Lab podcast, and my colleague at Stanford Psychiatry. In fact, he's our associate chair of psychiatry, world expert in hypnosis. He's been on this podcast before. We have an active research program focused on these issues. We are very much of the belief that a breathwork practice itself can be meditative. A meditation practice can include breathing, but the more that meditative practice focuses on the breathing itself, the more interoceptive biased it will be.